So this is a short workshop about feminism in debating. Hopefully there will be questions afterwards, so start thinking of your questions now if possible. I'll have a few kind of introductory remarks and then I'm going to talk about different ways of approaching debates about women's rights. So kind of how not to find yourself on the side of defending the patriarchy being maintained. Cool, so start with, so obviously this is not a workshop about like how to be a good feminist in real life or what the definition of feminism is outside debating. It's just a discussion of feminism within the context of debating and how to win feminist debates or take good results in feminist debates. So for that reason, there are a lot of assumptions that we'll make from the beginning. Obviously you guys all have some experience debating, so you understand that in debating it is generally an accepted fact that the patriarchy exists. We live in an unfair society, women are disadvantaged both individually and structurally by various social systems. So there is no, like, you will not find yourself having to defend the patriarchy or suggest that sexism isn't real or whatever. There are lots of viewpoints within that philosophy about how best to achieve female liberation, but you're not going to have to find yourself like saying that sexism is good. So in advance of debates about women's rights, it's generally good to educate yourself about facts and statistics that illuminate the ways in which women are disadvantaged in case you come up against a team who suggests that that's not true, or just in order to bolster your case generally. So think about researching maybe the pay gap, experiences of sexual violence, or gender ratios in positions of power. It can be really good just to have those statistics to throw out, explain and illuminate, particularly if you're in first prop, what is the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve in terms of misogyny in society right now. So, different ways of approaching debates about women's rights. So firstly, I'm going to talk about what I'll call liberal feminism. That's kind of like a very broad definition. It's not necessarily, like, people who believe this wouldn't necessarily identify as liberal feminists, but we'll call it that just for the sake of argument. So this is kind of about empowering women within existing current social structures. So if you think of maybe, if you're familiar with Sheryl Sandberg, kind of like Lean In, or Hillary Clinton running for president, that kind of vision of feminism, which is about the underrepresentation of women in cultural, economic and political positions of power, and kind of the reaching toward a better representation, so even 50-50 representation, obviously being a dream. So strategies can vary as to how to improve representation. So, for example, quotas in order to kind of have mandatory female participation, or maybe just like encouraging women to assert themselves on an individual level, like go for it, ask for that raise or promotion or whatever. But the ultimate goal there is to improve female representation. So other than being fair in itself, like it's just good because we'll have more women in positions of power, it also produces good outcomes for women. So there are kind of two sort of theories under this. So one would be like, you could call it critical mass theory. So it's the idea that women are better able to speak out in group situations or in, like on political committees or in boardrooms when they're backed by other women. So generally the figure that gets thrown around here is about a third. So once 33% of the group are women, and women feel more empowered to put women's issues on the table. They feel like it's less likely that they're going to get shouted down. So at that point then, that facilitates better discussion of women's issues generally, not just for the individual women who are there at the moment of the time. Secondly, and I guess relatedly, there's like the helping hand theory, so that like women will help other women once they reach a position of power. So this is like the idea that like once you have a female CEO, she'll be more likely to introduce free childcare within the corporation or to improve maternity leave for her female employees. This is the kind of idea that like once women have experienced sexism throughout their lives, when they get to a position of power, they can now ameliorate the sexism that other women experience. So that's kind of another liberal feminist argument as to why it's a good thing to have women in these positions. So these kind of arguments provide a very specific vision of gender equality, which is kind of like that men and women are sort of partners who can work toward equality together, and that they're essentially the same. There are no intrinsic differences between men and women, and that once we have a society that looks much the same as the one we currently have, but with a kind of better participation rate between women, then gender equality will kind of have been achieved. So, in counter to that, I guess there is a different school of thought, which, again, for the sake of argument, we'll call radical feminism. So this is about challenging, subverting, or in some cases destroying current social structures because they've traditionally excluded women. So there's like the Gloria Steinem quote, if the shoe doesn't fit, should we change the foot? The idea that like we have designed these systems of politics, business, culture, and if there is a reason that women keep getting excluded from them, maybe pushing women to take part in them is not the answer. Maybe the answer is changing the way that those systems work. This is the idea that like underrepresentation can't be fixed just by pushing individual women into particular positions. So if you think about like the Dole, yes, it's true that it is male dominated, and that in itself obviously makes it difficult for women. But like there are structural factors as well. So like the fact that like votes go on really late into the night, women still likely to be the primary childcarer within family unit, like usually feel that they cannot give that commitment. The prominence of the Dáil bar, the fact that decisions get made like between men who are drinking pints together, that kind of thing structurally excludes women, as well as like just the fact that there aren't enough women there. So strategies within this kind of framework can vary. Maybe it's that like we reform the institutions themselves before we try and push women into them, or maybe it's like revolution, we have to smash all the systems that we currently have and none of the institutions are working. But the ultimate goal is we need to change the shape of society in order to better suit women, rather than pushing women into the structures that we already have. So it's important, if you are pursuing this line in the debate, to think about the ways in which hierarchies of power, and even the concept of power itself, and the exercise of power through representation, can be repressive to women, even if they're led by women. And so there are kind of examples of this which counter the kind of critical mass arguments and helping hand arguments that we just talked about. So for example, if you look at like Margaret Thatcher, would be a very famous example. She froze child benefits, she cut investments in childcare. Like those things arguably were like actually made life worse for the majority of British women. And like it was not a good time to be a poor woman in Britain. If you look at like Sheryl Sandberg, her Lean In organisation partners with major corporations which discriminate against their female employees in terms of pay. So even organisations that are committed to the empowerment of women often replicate the same sexist structures that we see in companies that are dominated by men. So radical feminist arguments provide a vision of gender equality through radical structural change. It's not about pushing women to have like an equal number of CEOs or to have equal positions in the boardroom or in the Dáil. It's about changing the way our society looks so that women can take their role as equal partners. So under this kind of argumentative framework, generally it's not the idea that like men and women have no intrinsic differences is still true. So it's not like men and women are just born different, their brains are wired differently or whatever. But it is important to bear in mind that women share common experiences of sexism. So there is that linking factor between the experiences of women that does make it important to talk about women as a class rather than just a group of individuals. The fact that we've all experienced some forms of discrimination, we've all been held back in certain ways and by certain structures. It's also important to think about other things that link women. Obviously not every woman has children or wants to have children, but women do still have the duty of childcare forced upon them by society. So it's important to think about that in terms of the opportunities that women are denied because they're expected to do that extra work for no compensation, like carrying children or like doing housework, stuff like that. So those are kind of like two competing ways to think about feminism, and I suppose to get around the idea that you're on the like non-feminist side of the debate. There's almost always some way that you can think of that your side of the debate will represent women. Finally, I want to talk about intersectional feminism, but that's not opposed to the kind of argument that we just heard. Like generally, that should be wrapped into whatever argumentative framework you're using in a debate. And the idea of intersectional feminism is kind of to remind us that gender is not separate from other kind of axes of oppression, whether that be race, sexuality, class, or any other. And what I mean by that is not just the existence of gay women or the existence of women of colour. It's that experiences of gender and experiences of sexual discrimination are different for women who come from different classes and who experience sexist oppression on a different axis. So, for example, like for wealthy women in the developed world, like participating in a major corporation, getting a promotion, and like earning more than your husband might be seen as incredibly empowering. But like for a woman in the global south who's forced into having 13 or 14 children because of the value of child labour where she's living, obviously the capitalist system that's very different from that viewpoint. So it's not just it's not simple enough to say like all women will benefit from the pay gap being closed. It's important to think about the structures that uphold that pay gap and to ask ourselves questions about like those domineering structures like democracy, like capitalism, huge structures like that. Also important to think about this in terms of like international relations. So for example, obviously for an American woman, the Hillary 2012 thing might be hugely empowering to have a leader who finally reflects your experiences as an American woman. But like if you're a young Muslim girl living in North Waziristan who saw Hillary Clinton overseeing the drone program that destroyed your school, you might feel very differently about the idea that this is like a feminist presidency. So I suppose it's just to complicate the ways that we might think about female empowerment by reminding ourselves that there's not one shared experience of gender. It's not like there's just one global sisterhood where everyone experiences womanhood in the same way. It's actually a very complex phenomenon. And so within that, it's always important to remember that women are capable of participating in the oppression of other women. It's not like because a woman makes a choice, that's a liberating choice, and it's necessarily feminist and it's good for all women. Like, women can make choices to participate in systems of racism or in systems of classism, which do impact women in bad ways. So there's no like debate about intersectional feminism as such. It's not like there'll be a like, this house believes white feminists should control feminism, right? Like, as in everyone agrees that like better representation is, sorry guys, that representation is good. And that generally we traditionally have been held back by focusing far too much on the privileged few, whether that be within feminism or basically in any movement. Like, that's the reality. So it's not like we're going to debate about the identities of black women or the identities of trans women. Like, those are very much things that we all agree are important and valid. And it's just about how we centre those and whether the kinds of feminism we talk about are advantaging specific classes of women at the expense of other classes of women. And I suppose that's important to bear in mind. So there are debates within feminism, but there generally aren't debates about whether feminism is good. About whether certain kinds of feminism or certain kinds of feminist action are helpful, sure, but I think generally in debating we all share the goal of trying to liberate women and pursue female equality. And so with that in mind, it's important to think about the different ways in which we can kind of narrate that goal and envision a path toward achieving that. So that's kind of the end of my prepared material. But I would love if you guys had questions about this or about the Mace in general, since we're all here. Yep.
If you've got a motion like the lead-in movement motion where you basically have the prop running like liberal feminism and the other side running radical feminism, like the facts lie on the opposition side there. How do you win from the proposition side of that line? It's just much easier from the on.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, my sympathies don't lie with liberal feminism. That's probably obvious from the content of this presentation as well as from like knowing me in my regular life, as many of you do. I don't think that means it's impossible to win debate on a topic that you don't agree with. And I would be wary of saying like the facts lie with the other, because I think clever use of facts certainly lies with radical feminism, but it's equally possible, particularly in the Mace, which is great, to do your research and leverage facts in a way that suits you. So like for every Margaret Thatcher who screws over women when she gets into a position of power, there is another example of a woman who genuinely did help women when she got into a position of power. So like have those counterexamples, like do that background work, make sure that you, for every fact they throw out, can throw out another fact about how female participation can help. Like, it is difficult to defend certain things from a feminist perspective. I find it difficult to defend, like, you know, military intervention and stuff from a feminist perspective. But forcing yourself to do that, first of all, is an interesting, like, exercise in shoring up your own beliefs, in the sense that once you know you've come up with the best possible argument for it and you still don't believe it, you can at least walk away thinking, well, I know I'm right now, because I did genuinely try. But also, like, I think it's important not to foreclose on the possibility that there are interesting avenues to be pursued there. And don't feel you have to go down the liberal feminist route. Like, sometimes there are other arguments, like other avenues that at first aren't obvious, but then once you kind of get the thread, you can then be like, oh, okay, I see where I'm going with this. There is actually a group of vulnerable women who I can be on the side of here. I don't just have to be spouting the same stuff about female participation or Hillary 2012 or whatever. Unless you believe that, which is fine. Yeah.
This might not necessarily be like, it's probably still relevant to this in any case, but I think more relevant to like debating in say Euros or in the UK or stuff is when you feel like you're going up with a panel like with a panel of judges who you feel might not necessarily be receptive to like say more radical feminist cases, who might like question the validity of causes of like causes or terms or concepts within feminism, which you feel would take like a very long time to like run through sort of stuff. Like, how would like, I know that you've got like a great experience in like going through those sort of cases yourself and tend to win with them even against like more difficult judges. What sort of advice would you have for that?
Well, yeah, I think it's an interesting question. So firstly, try not to presuppose too much about your panel. Yeah. There are certain judges, though very few, who I think are probably like very unreceptive to feminist debates, but I think the vast majority of judges, particularly that you come across in the Mace, are perfectly receptive to hearing arguments about structural causes of feminism or sexism, or individual causes of sexism, or whatever. In terms of feeling you have to do a lot of analytical legwork to get to the point where your substantive material even starts, because you kind of have to be like, back in the dawn of patriarchy. Yeah, like that can be tough. So what I would say though is, in the Mace specifically, it's great to have that time to feel like you can hone your material where you're being as concise as you possibly can. And do use that time. So if you decide, you and your partner are like, yeah, we're going to run like a smash the stage anarchist feminist case or whatever, you now have the time to write 2 perfect paragraphs at the beginning of your speech that are going to explain to the judge, my perspective on this debate is this, and now my substantive begins. It can be a lot more difficult in BP. First of all, there's a very wide mix of judges. You're probably not even going to know the person who's judging you, so you have no idea what their pre-existing biases are, if any. I say if any, obviously everyone has pre-existing biases. But also, you don't have that time to like hone the perfect introduction to your speech. Honestly, the only way that improves is with practice. Like doing more BP competitions, hearing the feedback that you're getting, and just getting used to giving like the communist feminist intro or the liberal feminist intro or whatever means that you become more comfortable with your material. So with the Mace, I would say do your research, like get your introduction right if that is what you're doing. And with BP, I think it's probably more like practice as much as you can. Do drop-in dates and do IVs and stuff like that. Anything else? Yeah.
Like if you're arguing like radical feminist arguments, do you have any particular ways that you try and make them seem very impactful? Not like, I guess like you might be like living in a dream world or whatever, like you know where the art go, like that's a nice idea, but it doesn't actually, like you can't actually change these things, like I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and that does come up a lot. And I guess like there are certain debates in which it feels like the radical feminist argument is like, that may be true, and so what? Like, for example, in an argument about quotas, like it may well be true that we should actually smash the government and live in an anarchist paradise. But like the fact is, while we're here, we're stuck with the system we have, and we have to participate in it to an extent. I think you have to be wise. So I do think you have to ask yourself, when you're preparing for debates like this, is this kind of revolutionary perspective that I'm going to go down, like, satisfying in terms of outcomes as well as analysis? Because if you feel like, oh, the analysis is great and I'm definitely correct in what I'm saying about this structure, that's all very well, but what are the outcomes of your argument? Are you changing anything? I guess most of the time, what you're saying is not necessarily we're going to change it, but that you're going to make it worse. So by pulling back from those structures and trying to demonstrate how damaging they are to women, often then you can point to stuff like Lean In or whatever and say, yeah, okay, we may not be able to change capitalism right now, but what you're doing is making it worse. You are, in whatever way, shoring up the power of capitalism over women's lives and forcing us, instead of critiquing it or instead of encouraging us to be conscious of the ways in which capitalism affects women, you're encouraging us to actually be blind to that and to just enter into it with a kind of naive sort of perspective. I think in certain ways, because radical critiques are so structural and so unlikely to result in any immediate outcomes, you do have to be careful of exactly how you're leveraging them. And as I said, they mostly work as a comparative in terms of does liberal feminism actually make life worse in some way? Usually it makes life better for a small minority of women, but is there a way in which that happens at the expense of a kind of a kind of other who we're not talking about in the debate, whether that be women? Being able to say, to bring those people as subjects into the debate and point out the ways in which their lives can be affected by this, I think is very important. But yeah, you're right, that is something to bear in mind, that often people will say, yeah, you may be right in the abstract, but there need to be consequences at the end of your point. And so ask yourself what those consequences are. Don't get too carried away with the kind of philosophical underpinnings of your case. Any other questions? Yeah?
In terms of making intersectional arguments, and I've had this happen a couple of times to myself in debates, is when you're making an argument about an intersection between women and a reasonably small minority of women, and you make a case which is quite fundamental in proving that those that it has quite a harm to them, but it's reasonably small minority of women, you can be hit by feedback from judges, even if they are the most vulnerable group in the debate. We feel the opposition had a more sort of major thing. I think an example of this was in one particular debate where I was speaking closing proposition, and we managed to prove that the motion, which I can't remember because it was a year or so ago, was quite harmful to trans women. And the opposition responded to essentially with like, well, we have to like weigh up the harms and benefits.
Okay, yeah, I mean...
And the judges came to defend over us on that grounds, like essentially.
Yeah, that's tough. Okay,
Yeah.
so first thing I would say that I think, especially in terms of trans women, who are obviously numerically a very small minority, I think the debating circuit in particular has become more and more aware of trans issues, which I think is great. And I think now maybe we're in a climate where judges will be less likely to dismiss arguments like that, because I think over even just the last year or so, I think we've become a little bit more conscious of how important trans women are as a kind of as a demographic. So hopefully that specific problem won't happen again. But in terms of other like relatively small, but not as small minorities like gay women, I think you have to emphasise the extent to which you are being utilitarian in your analysis. So it's not just like we're helping a tiny number of people, you're helping a larger number of people but neglecting our tiny number. Oh, now let's take out the weighing scales. The point is that by helping people who are already in a relative position of privilege, you're achieving little. Whereas by helping people who are in a really precarious position where they're very vulnerable, you're achieving a lot. Like, obviously the economics analogy is imperfect, but bear with me. Like, I guess it's like saying, oh, this tax break for middle class families is like, oh, it's going to be helpful, you know, it'll be a little bit less of a burden to send your kids to college or whatever. It's just, even in a strictly utilitarian sense, less important than saying we save just a small number of people from being plunged into complete poverty or homelessness. It just seems like the needs of those people and the marginal benefits that they gain are more important than the marginal benefits gained by a group of people who are already reasonably comfortable, who won't have their lives plunged into complete misery by whatever happens. So I think you need to emphasise that when a group of people are particularly marginalised and vulnerable in society, any small change in their circumstances is likely to be really, really important. Whereas when a group is like, you know, perhaps not, you know, a white straight man, but not, you know, a million miles away either. The changes in their circumstances are obviously important, but don't bear that cataclysmic weight that they might for a group who've been really neglected. Does that kind of make sense? So yeah, emphasising that I think can help in that kind of utilitarian calculus sort of sense. Yeah?
It rose around if there was a motion about only giving loans to women in developing countries, and Oxford, in closing opposition, were able to point out that's really harmful to gay men, like the economy in general and stuff like that, while closing Gulf were able to put out the rock hard feminist case that Oxford still won. How would you go about like negating, like, okay, this may cause economic harm and it may cause harm for these other disadvantaged groups, but how do you like weigh it up so like the feminist side comes out ahead in that?
Yeah, okay, so this is a very specific debate. It's the debate about only giving loans. Are you guys all familiar with it? Did you all watch the live stream that Michael and you were on? Okay, so the debate about microloans. I think in that debate, and I feel like I'm giving Michael and Dee feedback now, which is obviously not what I intend to do. I actually think they were very good in that debate. But I think that it's important not to feel as though when you're on that side, you have to be like, okay, we may not have the economy and we may not be able to help all these other minorities, but we do get women. Like, I think you have to remind yourself that half of all those minorities will be women. Like, gay people are discriminated against, certainly. Gay women also are, so it's important to bear in mind that you can reach out to communities like ethnic minorities were brought up in that debate, which like I do find a little bizarre. Obviously, if ethnic minorities are discriminated against, the women in those groups are particularly discriminated against, so it's even more important to ensure that those communities, through the women in those communities, are getting the kind of loans that they were talking about. In terms of the like, this hurts the economy in general, I think that point hinges very much on the assumption that women are economically just not on par with men, which, I mean, maybe, I don't know, I don't think so. And I think you have to remind yourself that like, you're not cornering yourself into accepting all these kind of giving away the sort of middle ground of the debate by doing the feminist stuff. You can also say, well look, at the end of the day, men and women have exactly the same ability to do linear reasoning and math and have ideas about how to start a business. So it is just as likely that you're going to be able to find them to give these loans to as you are going to be able to find men. You don't need to be exceptionally gifted to be able to start a business. So it's not like, oh, but what if we lose out on Einstein? You know, it's just a group of people who you know, have an idea about how to start a business. And there are loads of other things, some of which I think came up in the debate. So for example, a man can just share his ideas with a woman, and she can be the CEO and he could be the chief operating officer, or whatever, CFO or whatever. It just seems like there are ways around having to concede that huge middle ground. And remember that feminist arguments aren't niche. You don't have to be like, oh, well, you may get every other single point in the debate, but at least we have women. Like, you can still continue to fight the rest of the debate and still hold your corner as being the like pro-women side. And I think if you manage to do that, you should probably be the top team in the debate, because that can be a tricky thing to do. Any other questions about feminism or the Mace in general? Oh, you're all confident that you're going to win? Well, you can't all. So.
Tell us more.